Welcome all to my paranormal closet where the stories and magic take place. In 1961, today's guests' aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill, had a close encounter and UFO abduction in New Hampshire's White Mountains. As a family member, she was able to get firsthand information on the account, on the exact day they arrived home, and the subsequent days following the event. Since then, she has devoted years of research to their abduction case, and we will be discussing all of this and then some on today's show. Join me in welcoming Kathleen Marden. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
I personally read Captured on your aunt and uncle's account and was extremely intrigued by what happened. My research ultimately led to you and asking for you to come onto my show to discuss your findings. As I understand it, it's because of Betty and Barney Hill's UFO abduction that you became an author, investigator, and researcher, correct?
That is correct.
How did your aunt and uncle feel about your involvement into the investigation process of their encounter?
Well, my uncle died in 1969 when I was in college, so I was not doing a formal investigation of their case at that time, although I was very much involved at a personal and family level. And they felt fine. We had a very close relationship. So after Barney passed on, I had a typical career. I studied social work. I had my degree in that. And then I ended up going into education as a teacher and then as an education services coordinator. And then I I developed a disabling illness back in the late 1980s and decided what I could do for intellectual stimulation. I couldn't just sit at home. I mean, in my previous career, I had been writing, I had been inventing, doing so many productive things that I wasn't going to let this illness get me down. So I decided that I would begin a formal investigation of what happened to my aunt and uncle. I wanted to separate fact from fiction, and I also wanted to write my aunt's biography. So she gave me permission to do this. She had an extensive archival collection, and she gave me, and actually I'm the trustee of her archival collection, including the hypnosis tapes with Dr. Benjamin Simon. Now, I did my own investigation at physical archives as well. So it involved a great deal of research and investigation, hours and hours of investigation, going back to the close encounter route with her, going to the abduction site over and over again, hearing and tape recording the messages that she gave to me. Eventually, I would go up there without her. I wanted to measure distances. I even made a trip with my husband of the entire route that Betty and Barney took in 1961, looking for any holes in the case, any conventional explanation for what happened to them, and measured distance, measured times, sort of reconstructed the route that they went on, following those back roads that they were traveling on. We have new major highways now. We didn't have all those highways back then. So we traveled on the old routes. And by that time, I had listened to those hypnosis tapes and their descriptions so many times that I was seeing what they observed back in 1961. I have to tell you that at the end of our trip, my husband and I were much older than Betty and Barney were at the time of their UFO encounter. It has been said by skeptics that they had driven so long they must have been hallucinating. And I can tell you that my husband and I were not hallucinating, nor did we have a UFO encounter on our route. And so, I think all in all, I probably have more information and have done more research and investigation than anyone else.
What happened to them that night?
Well, they were returning home overnight, anticipating an arrival at 2 o'clock in the morning. They had traveled from Montreal to Colebrook, New Hampshire, arriving at about 9 o'clock or so, 8 there, left at 10:05. They checked their watches against the clock in the restaurant and headed south. They were returning home to their house on the seacoast in Portsmouth. The reason they made this decision is that a hurricane was whirling up the coast and they wanted to arrive home before it hit. Also, they made the decision that they would stop overnight if they grew tired. But they were well rested from the night before. They were having a wonderful vacation. And they were just traveling south on Route 3 through upstate New Hampshire when, just south of Lancaster, my aunt spotted a new light in the sky. And what drew her attention to it is that it was traveling upward in sort of an arc. And she had never seen anything like that. And it was sort of the reverse of a falling star. She wondered what it could possibly be. She thought of a satellite. It wasn't a satellite. She thought of a falling star. It wasn't a falling star. And she watched it as it grew larger and larger in the sky. Finally, south of Twin Mountain, which, was maybe a half-hour, 45-minute drive, she and Barney stopped because this object was coming in closer and closer. They got out of the car. They had binoculars because they had been to Niagara Falls, and they needed binoculars if they wanted to see a close-up of the falls. And so they got out of the car with the binoculars. They had their little dog, Delcy, who was a dachshund, with them. Barney walked the dog. Betty looked at this object, which was now unidentified, but it was strange because it crossed the face of the moon, flashing multicolored lights. It was silent, and it wasn't that far away. Betty then gave the binoculars to Barney, and he looked at it, and he was dismissive. He was a confirmed skeptic. He thought that there had to be some kind of a prosaic explanation for this. They headed south again and entered Franconia Notch at the north entrance. And there was the craft that had been traveling beside them that now surged ahead over Cannon Mountain. And so they stopped again on the other side of Cannon Mountain where the old man of the mountain stood. The profile was 48 feet from forehead to chin. I said was because it fell off the mountain in 2003, and that was a tragic event because it was New Hampshire's state symbol.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes, but the profile was sat 1,200 feet above the ground, and of course I said 48 feet in length, and this craft was hovering beside the old man's profile. And Betty could determine at that time that it was at least 1.5 times the length of the profile. It appeared to be rotating. It would stand still, it would flip upward, it would flip horizontally, and it would move down. Then it started to bounce back and forth in the sky. So this was extraordinarily interesting to them.
I imagine so. Oh, my goodness.
So as time went on, they decided to pull over again to get another look at this thing, but it was in a parking area where there were tall trees all around. They could not see it. So they went immediately back onto the highway. This was Route 3 still in those days, and into the tourist section of Lincoln, New Hampshire. They went by what is now the Indian Head Resort. There were cabins in that time frame. In fact, a historical marker for Betty and Barney sits in front of the Indian Head Resort. The state of New Hampshire erected this to commemorate this event.
I love that. I love that the state erected this historical marker for them, because to me that shows that they have that public, they're giving that public their support of what happened. They're admitting to the fact that it did happen, you know?
Well, they're admitting that at least there is a tremendous amount of documentation indicating that it did happen. I was one of the two people behind this, but since I was the trustee of their estate, I was the person who had to submit all of the evidence, the documentation, and also to write what I wanted to have appear on the historical marker.
Good for you.
So that was erected in 2011. Now, getting back to what happened to Betty and Barney, they drove past the Indian Head Resort. They were approximately a mile and a half south of there when suddenly this craft surged ahead again. It was coming lower and lower, and it stopped beside the highway about 200 feet overhead. Barney had to brake the car in the middle of the road so that he would not be under this craft. I've investigated cases where people attempted to drive under this craft, and they were taken up into it immediately. They experienced a couple of hours of missing time and ended up on a different road, on a different part of the highway. This is part of my investigations of other people in that area who had these kinds of events. So Betty and Barney, Barney stopped the car and opened the door, stepped out of the car with the binoculars, looked up at this object that was just hanging there in the sky. He said it looked like a giant pancake. And there was apparently a row of windows on the forward edge. And he stepped away from the car to get a better look. And when he did, the object shifted and moved in an arc-like manner over the highway and stopped above a field. There was a farmer's stand in the field. There were a few apple trees, and it descended to within 100 feet of Barney. He was shaking his head. He was pulling the binoculars down. He walked toward it. He left the area, the location of the car, and walked toward it. And when he looked up through binoculars, he saw entities, figures, looking down at him. They were all dressed in black uniforms. He wrote to NICAP in the second report he made. The first was to the Pease Air Force Base. And there was something about them that made him believe they were non-human. And suddenly all but one moved in unison to what appeared to be the backside of a corridor. And he could see them. Their arms went up into the air. He could see them from the tops of their arms to about their knees at this point. And when they did this, little red lights started to slide out on fin-like structures. This has happened in the past in other cases as well. And then the one remaining at the window was staring down at Barney and frightened him greatly. He thought that this entity had a plan for him. Somehow he knew this. and that plan was to capture him. Something started to slide down out of the bottom of the craft. Barney didn't know what it was. I know what it is, and I even have video of this kind of beam that came down almost like a laser beam, but not a laser beam. It seemed to be the beam that hit abductees and carried them to craft. So Barney saw this, and his intuition was right. He pulled the binoculars away from his eyes so forcefully that he broke the leather strap and ran screaming to Betty, back to the car, that they had to get out of there or they were going to be captured.
Oh, wow.
He had left the car running. The interior light was on. He threw the binoculars on the seat, slammed the car door, put it in to drive, and went tearing down the highway. As he entered the as he entered his vehicle, the craft was moving in his direction. And within a few blocks, he and Betty heard a series of code-like buzzing sounds that were striking the trunk of their vehicle. In fact, the following day, they found shiny, highly polished spots there in that area that caused a compass needle to rotate rapidly, meaning that there was a magnetic field in that area. And this was on the trunk of the car, not up front where you would have this happen. So they did feel these buzzing sounds in their bodies, in their vehicle. Betty, in fact, felt of the metal to see if she would receive an electric shock. It was kind of a strong electrical sensation. And it's in the early reports. So it's documented evidence. Also, they started to lose their awareness of what was occurring simultaneously. And the next thing they knew, they found themselves about 35 miles down the highway. They had memories of finding themselves on another road, not the highway they were traveling on. It was a dirt road with tall trees all around. They had memories of a roadblock. They had memories of observing a fiery orb, but they didn't know where that occurred. And it was so perplexing. They continued driving home when they heard the second series of buzzing sounds, when their full memory was restored, except for what happened on the craft when they were abducted. They continued to speak with one another, to drive home. They were looking for a police officer to report this to. They yearned for human contact. They were looking for a coffee shop that might be open, but nothing was open. And when they returned home, it wasn't 2 or 3 in the morning as they had anticipated. By Betty's watch that she set and wound when she went into her home and checked the clock, it was 5:16 a.m.
So they lost several hours.
They lost several hours, and there was physical evidence that something had happened to them. Betty's dress was torn in several locations. At the top of the zipper, in the thick zipper fabric. Her hem was torn down on one side, and the lining of her dress was torn from waist to hemline. Barney's best dress shoes were so deeply scraped that he had to relegate them to garden work and had to purchase new shoes. As I said, their watches had stopped running and never ran again. And there were those perplexing spots on the trunk of the vehicle They felt clammy, is the word that Betty used.
Ooh.
Much more so than you would if you had taken a drive from Montreal to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So there were so many questions about what
Do you
had occurred.
think that the fiery scene that they recall, do you feel like that was implanted in their minds so that they would think that there was some sort of accident and try and remember it as an accident of some sort? Or do you think that actually happened?
I think that actually happened because 2.5 years later, when they saw Dr. Benjamin Simon, a famed neuropsychiatrist who worked with veterans returning from the war to restore them to full health when they had suffered from physiological symptoms that were psychogenically induced. And Barney had this problem. He was hospitalized with bleeding ulcers. He had to take a leave of absence from work. This was a life-threatening condition due to the anxiety that he experienced over having had this experience and having full recall of observing these non-humans and this close encounter. So they were referred to Dr. Simon. Barney was, at least. Betty went with him, and she asked Dr. Simon if he would take her on as a patient as well. He agreed as long as he saw them separately for hypnosis, deep trance hypnosis, and he reinstated amnesia at the end of each session, so they couldn't compare notes. It wasn't until the end of all of the hypnosis sessions that he took them in to listen to those audio tapes of what the other had stated. And they discovered that, yes, they had been abducted. They had partial recall. They always had this recall. From the time it happened, they made repeated trips up to that area of New Hampshire, up to the mountains, to look for the spot where this occurred. So it wasn't something that was revealed for the first time under hypnosis. They did have conscious recall of that part of it. I don't know if there was any screen memory there. Barney, under hypnosis, talked about a Cheshire cat. But what he was talking about, I believe, is the glowing eyes that he was seeing as these entities were coming toward him.
Interesting. So, I've heard in other documentaries them referred to with like owl eyes almost.
Yes, you might refer to them as like owl eyes. It was the same kind of thing, but he didn't see an owl.
Right.
Well, all he and Betty consciously recalled was a roadblock.
Interesting. Now, why do you suppose that they abducted them and others besides?
Well, there's my opinion, and then there's Betty's and Barney's opinion. Betty and Barney believed that they wanted to determine the differences between humans and themselves. But I have to tell you that they were well set up to do abductions. And as a researcher and investigator, I was the founder and director of the Mutual UFO Network's Experiencer Resource Team. It was then the research team for 10 years. And we had case after case of individuals who had been taken onto craft. And they were always pretty similar. They were taken, they were put on tables, and tissue samples were extracted. They were then perhaps implanted with devices by these non-human entities. And when they were going to be taken again, they were oftentimes aware that they were going to be taken again. I believe that these entities were able to communicate with these humans through these listening devices. So it has happened to many other people. It's more than just wanting to learn the differences between them and us. That's what Betty and Barney thought. They underwent an unconventional physical examination. Some have been told that the entities are concerned about the presence of environmental toxins in human bodies. There is usually some kind of learning process, education, after the exam takes place, where the human being is given information about the ET's concern about our use of nuclear weapons, concern about how we are still primitive, yet we have advanced technology. They're concerned about our spiritual development, our maturity, and fear that we might destroy our planet if we don't change our ways. And so they have also been collectors. They've been collectors of DNA for in case we do damage our planet or destroy life on our planet. I would speculate that perhaps they're seeding other planets with our DNA too. They've been seen taking vegetative matter, taking plants way back in the 1950s. And then it advanced to taking animals, forest animals.
Wow.
And then they began taking humans. So this has been a very long, complicated program. It appears to be a scientific program.
Taking, are they taking and returning them? Or are they taking and keeping them?
For the most part, they're taking and returning them. I am not aware of any of the abductees or contactees that I have worked with, and it has been a few thousand. For me, for my team, it's been about 12,000.
Wow.
We're not aware of anyone who has been taken and not returned. And once they're taken repeatedly. So, it's not a one-time event generally. But in the frightening media, you might read about those who have been taken and never returned, or people who have gone
that's what I was going to
missing.
say. That's what I've heard. And some people that I've interviewed that were abductees themselves said that when they were there were people that were never returned. And so it makes you wonder about the missing persons number that is so large in many places. That could there be some truth to the fact that some of these people are taken and not returned?
That is true. Now, we have to ask, did they go voluntarily?
Right.
Were there actually extraterrestrials who appeared to be human, who are only joining their extraterrestrial family? Or were they taken for some other purpose? There are many questions surrounding that question. And I don't have the answers.
Human alien beings too. Could they be one of each? Like part human, part alien.
Absolutely. Could they be? Perhaps they are.
It's very frightening to think about it and to wrap your head around the possibility. And then you think, is there just one species or are there more? I imagine that we can't be the only beings out there. And from these people being abducted, you understand that there is something else out there. But I feel like there's more than one. I feel like it's not just us and them. I feel like that there must be more. How do you feel about that?
I've worked on 3 major studies on about 5,000 experiencers, and 2 of those studies were with PhD academics, retired. And what we discovered is that there are several species. There are variations of those species. The grays, what you think of as the grays, are most predominant. There are the human types that come second. And then there are reports of insectoids that look like mantis, large praying mantises, only humanoid. Avian, bird-like, only humanoid, extraterrestrials. Tall whites, various forms of reptilians. So those are the major types. Now there are different varieties, so it increases the number. Some people speculate it's in the 60s or 70s or even more. But when you take a really good look at this, it's generally variations on the same body type.
Oh my goodness. Well, somewhere along the line, you switched your focus to advocating for the respectful treatment of people who interacted willingly and unwillingly with non-human entities. I guess my question is, when you advocate for them, who are you advocating them against? And when you say willingly interacted with non-human entities, what exactly do you mean?
Okay, 2 questions. Why did I switch? I was a cold investigator in the beginning. I was a nuts and bolts investigator. When I interviewed someone who claimed that they had been abducted, I was not sympathetic. I wasn't cruel, but I was looking for evidence. I was like a police detective doing an interview, not showing emotion, not showing much compassion, looking for evidence. And then I began to realize over time that, in a sense, it was cruel. These people were suffering, and I was judging them based upon the physical evidence that they could present. Anyone can tell a story. I decided that I could no longer do this because I'm a compassionate person. And I would never do anything that would hurt anybody. So I started to interview these individuals with compassion. Most of them did not have evidence, but there were some cases that were major cases with a great deal of evidence that something highly unusual had occurred, including video evidence that showed non-humans coming in on beams of light to abduct 3 individuals. And one of those individuals already had a confirmed investigated case of alien abduction. So it's that sort of thing that I do. And then the Mutual UFO Network asked me to write protocols on how to investigate a UFO abduction. So I spent over a year working with Denise Stoner very closely and a team of professional consultants on how to do this kind of investigation. And that is what MUFON's field investigators follow. I thought that we needed to have case dispositions for experiencers. It's not, did the person see a UFO? Was this something different than a UFO? That kind of thing. That doesn't address whether a person was taken to craft.
Sorry about that.
Would you like to wait?
It's just a minute. Sorry.
Okay. I'm seeing myself frozen on my screen. Am I frozen on yours?
I'm fine, but all I can see is your picture. I can't see you. Where we were talking to each other face to face, I can't see you now. So I don't know if your camera shut off or if it's just frozen or it's just the connection, but
yeah,
that sometimes happens. So But I know you're
Okay.
there. I can hear you perfectly.
Okay. Okay, good. So just let me
I
know
know
when
you.
you want.
Thank you. Go ahead. You can begin.
Okay. I'm just waiting to make sure that your dog is not barking. Okay. So I felt compassion toward these individuals. And then the Mutual UFO Network asked me to form a team of experienced, highly knowledgeable field investigators who had a great deal of information about ET contact, UFO abductions, that kind of thing, to speak non judgmentally to people who were seeking help in resolving the trauma that they were experiencing as a result of their ET contact events. We started out with 3 members, and today we have about 60.
60 members. That's crazy. Um, does this is this the reason for you writing the book about extraterrestrial contact and how to react and how to behave when you do get abducted? Did one come before the other? Because I find it really interesting how you could write a book to explain what someone should do if they are abducted.
Yes, I wrote that for this specific reason. And 3 of the members of the ERT joined me, 2 writing 1 chapter. One was the psychotherapist who worked with experiencers. Another is a seasoned investigator and an abductee. And the
Oh,
other one has a background in psychology and is also a psychic. And so she wrote about being transformed by these experiences. So I wrote the majority of the book, but I wanted to have their opinions as well because they specialized in important areas. In fact, the one who was the seasoned investigator and abductee is also a specialist in the paranormal. And we found that there is a paranormal overlay in the majority of these cases.
mm,
Experiencers see what appear to be intelligent light orbs in their homes. Their
wow.
beds might feel like something unseen is walking on them, uh,
Hmm.
that sort of thing. So, to help people to separate out, is this simply a paranormal event or is it ET related? How can you investigate your own case in case you don't want to report it to an agency and have it go on the record?
I'm really sorry, Kathleen.
That's
There's a
no problem.
construction going on in my development, and then as soon as the dogs see something, they go crazy. If can I just go lock them up?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for your patience with me. I apologize.
Yes.
Thank goodness this isn't a podcast that I can edit.
Yes, thank goodness. But I'm having a little problem here because while you were gone, I decided to turn my video off to see if I could get it working again. And
Yes.
it's remaining off. I keep clicking it to turn it on, and it's
Well,
still
that's
off.
okay. We have your audio, so that'll be fine because the actual podcast is audio.
Oh,
So,
okay. That's good
so
news.
it'll be fine. Yeah. No, I'm so sorry. You could pick up where you left off.
Okay. I have also worked with contactees and interviewed many individuals who call in craft. Sometimes they see the non-human entities on the craft, and infrequently they might have one of these non-human entities actually come in to their own environment, maybe more than one. So it's pretty
Hmm.
amazing. I don't have video of that from these individuals, but this is the claims that they have been making. Um, and enough of them have made this claim that, perhaps it actually has happened. It's more than one person who's observing this. Then I took part in an experiment with an individual from the UK originally. He was a police officer in England. He grew up there. And when he was a boy, he had two non-humans appear to him. They frightened him terribly. But then one came back as an orb and communicated with him at a later date and taught him how to astral travel. And
Oh.
so for many years, he astral traveled. He was also taken aboard a craft when he was a paper boy, uh, a teenager. And then he moved to the United States with his wife, who had worked at a college in the psychology department. And I happened to meet them and eventually was invited to take part in an experiment. That's the way I thought of it, and the other investigators thought of it as an experiment to determine whether or not this was real or who he was actually communicating with. He thought it was extraterrestrials. And so we met several times. And during one of the interviews, my fellow researchers said that he appeared to actually be channeling information. He was
Hmm.
not aware that he was channeling. But from there, one of these interviewers, who was an ordained minister and a psychotherapist, interviewed him and taught him how to meditate and to communicate with these non-humans. And he began communicating with them, some of them. They claim to be from a council of extraterrestrials who were in this quadrant of our galaxy, that they were a protective force, and they were overseeing our planet and the activities on our planet, that they were monitoring us, they were assisting in our development, they were sharing information during the sleep cycle to prominent scientists to help us to move along scientifically, that they had contacted leaders throughout the world wanting to reveal themselves, and no one was interested in this
Oh my
process.
goodness.
On and on. In fact, we met for 2 years, and once a month, we were able to take our questions to this individual's home and take our scientific equipment to attempt to collect evidence. We did collect evidence on a laser thermometer. We measured up to a 10-degree increase in the environment directly around this experiencer,
Mm.
as opposed to around us and the rest of the room. We,
Wow.
without realizing it initially, all felt an intense electrical kind of tingling sensation in our bodies. It reminds me of what my aunt described to me. And as I went on to investigate this, I discovered that many experiencers of ET contact have the same sensation in their own bodies. So I found that extraordinarily interesting. And then they introduced themselves to us one at a time, and in our group, and told us who they were and why they were here. We couldn't see them. We might see a shadow on some of them. So we knew they were there visually, but we never had them materialize in front of us. Then they wanted to show us evidence. They showed us craft, but not close up. One of them, who claimed to be a Zeta reptilian scientist, a gray, said that he wanted to communicate with me. And I agreed with trepidation to connect with him. He came into my environment. I could feel that strong tingling sensation. And we did have telepathic communication in the strangest place. I was a passenger in my husband's vehicle as we were driving down the highway.
Oh my.
But we had this communication, and I had that very strong tingling sensation. I asked a few questions. It's a good thing that I found paper and a pen, because I wrote this down. Because when he left, I no longer remembered it. It was only there on paper and pencil. I remembered the tingling. I remembered his presence, but not what was communicated for some reason. Maybe it was just so shocking to me. But then he came back from time to time and gave me information, communicated with me. And other members of this group had communication too. Dr. Barton, who was the minister and the psychotherapist, had communication telepathically. Denise Stoner had telepathic communication. Both saw craft when they were told they were going to see craft. So I saw orbs. I saw, I wanted to see craft. We had arranged for that to happen. But what I saw was I live on a lake. I saw a huge, maybe 40-foot circle of turbulent water that seemed to be calm in the center, but turbulent on the outside. And I was expecting to see a craft rise up out of the lake. I knew that Zeta scientist was with me. I could feel his presence with me. But I did not see a craft rise up out of the lake. But it certainly was something that occurred. I'd never seen this before. I've never seen it again.
And so maybe it was there. It was invisible.
Yes, it could have been cloaked or invisible. Or maybe it was that gray scientist who was doing that is evidence for me. But true. You can read about all of this in my book, Forbidden Knowledge.
I was just getting ready to ask you if that's what this book was about, the personal journey from alien abduction to spiritual transformation. And I can see that connection of them wanting to help us spiritually grow, because we need more of that in the world today, because there is such division and anger and hatred that we really need to find that spiritual connection and find peace. So please tell us about that book.
I'd be happy to. Actually, there are 2 editions of that book. The first edition is spiritually oriented. It talks about my growth, my history of being from my childhood through my life and my spiritual journey as I went from a nuts and bolts kind of person, not believing that this could be true in a sense, to actually experiencing it, to investigating the spiritual side of all of this. And it also has 120 of the questions that we asked to this Council of 8, and my spiritual journey beyond that. So it's a book about my personal history. The second edition of this book that I published only recently, but it's on Amazon, and Amazon has made a mistake. It lists it as the first edition date. It's not the first edition date. So you can purchase it for Amazon, or you can purchase it directly from me on my website at Kathleen-Marden.com. So the second book is about my personal history, my relationship with my Aunt Betty Hill, what I went through with her, the knowledge that I acquired from her, and my history of doing this. It also goes into the beginning of my career as a ufologist and as an investigator, researcher, and author. The work that I did, what I discovered. I also talk about that experiment in the book. I talk about information that I received from the granddaughter of a Navy Rear Admiral and his experiment. And so that sort of prompted me to agree to this experiment, even though it is taboo, even though it is forbidden knowledge. So all of that is explained. My academic history, my research history, those I've worked with, and what we have discovered as a team. Those who I greatly admire, those who I modeled my career after, and also that major case that I talked about earlier. I referred to the physical evidence of on video on these 3 highly credible individuals who were abducted and what they believed happened. I had actually done the hypnosis on 2 of those individuals and just interviewed the third. So there's a great deal of information there. I'm going to write about that in greater detail on my next book that I'm going to begin writing probably in May or June. Dr. Barton and I have been working on a survey. And this survey is on my website. You can find the link there. It's a survey on belief in extraterrestrials and religious belief as well. So anyone can take it. Mm-hmm. Those members of the general public who might be listening to this can take the first answer the first 25 questions, and we'd greatly appreciate it. We have about 650 responses so far. We're going to be closing this at the end of the month. And so we would appreciate as many surveys as we can get. Anyone who participates will not be identified, will only be using the information they submit. The second part of the survey that does not have to be completed is about those who have experienced ET contact or contact with religious beings or contact with non-human entities or ghosts or whatever. If you've had continued contact with something else, that's non-human or might have at one time been human. Would like your feedback on that as well. And
Oh, I'll have
all of this.
you because I'm a paranormal investigator. It's interesting how I'm 58 and I had experiences as a child and used to have premonitions when I was a kid, and then something traumatic happened and it shut it down and I never got it back. But I was always fascinated by the paranormal, but it wasn't until I wrote my first book, which was a psychological thriller, that this paranormal life fell into my lap and started a whole new career for me over 50. So I became a
Uh-huh.
paranormal investigator because I was writing true account ghost stories that people were sharing with me that happened to them. Like you're writing about people's UFO encounters, I'm writing about their paranormal ghostly stories.
Yes.
So
And
I find that very interesting how our journeys lead us in different directions that we least expect.
yes, absolutely, they do. And I think that it's a result of the knowledge we gain. And from that knowledge, we take the next step.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for what you do because I think it's really important work. And I think that
Thank you.
those people that experience these abductions need to be acknowledged and understood, and that information should be shared with the world. So thank you for all that you've done for so many years.
It has been my pleasure and my greatest goal in life. So thank you so much for inviting me
You're welcome.
to appear on your show.
Appreciate it. And to the listeners out there, if you like listening to this week's episode and you're into all things paranormal, check out my other show, Eleanor Wagner's Creeping It Real podcast, out of the Coast to Coast Entertainment Network, which is available wherever you get your podcasts. If you miss any episode, you can watch it and listen to it directly on my Eleanor Wagner YouTube channel. If any of you are interested in reading any of my books, you can find them on Amazon, but you can get signed copies directly through me at authoreleanorwagner@gmail.com. I write about the history of the town and the location, add the paranormal story to the mix, and I finish it all off with photos and evidence. I hope you'll stay a while and listen as Silent Crafters Stranger Part 2 takes us out of the shell. There we go.
Okay.